The idea was at the time is that, well, we're nobodies in this bourbon world. So why would anybody listen to us about what we're saying or what we're drinking? So instead, we figured, let's be the idiots that ask all the questions, and we'll invite guests on that are really the know-all and be-all in the bourbon world. So they become the authoritative source, and they're the ones that actually are really giving the audience the education, the information they want. A lot of these people took a big gamble on us in the very beginning, and we had never done a podcast before. We didn't know what we were doing. We were flying by the seat of our pants. We didn't know if we had the right equipment. We didn't know if we were using the right software, the right music, and we just kind of went with it.
Hello and welcome to the Beautiful Work Podcast. I am your host, Dan Krikorian. I am a songwriter, college basketball coach, and professor from Southern California. Each episode here, we feature a special guest from all walks of life, and we ask them to explore the triumphs, challenges, and the twists and turns that they have taken in their chosen fields. Writers, musicians, coaches, athletes, business owners, and everything in between, we peel back the curtain to hear their stories, to walk their paths, to find out how they breathe life into their beautiful work. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Beautiful Work Podcast. If you are new and just joining us, welcome. We're so glad to have you. We are right in the middle of a special portion of the Beautiful Work Podcast, which is Whiskey Week, a whole week of episodes featuring folks that are a part of the whiskey and bourbon industry in the United States and beyond. And today's guests are Kenny Coleman and Ryan Cecil from Bourbon Pursuit podcast, which is the biggest and best bourbon podcast out there. And I'm really excited to have them. Quickly, before we begin the show, if you guys could, and a lot of you have, and I appreciate it very much, go to iTunes and rate and like and leave a comment about the podcast, preferably a positive one. That would be great. It really helps other people find it and to continue to grow the audience. We also have a Patreon page. For those of you new to Patreon, it's a way to support projects like this. And I know Kenny and Ryan have it for Bourbon Pursuit, and they've done a great job of building that. And we have the same thing here. And so if you like what's going on, please feel free to visit Patreon. And it's under Beautiful Work Podcast, patreon.com/Beautiful Work Podcast. You can also find the Patreon links on my website, dankrikorian.com or beautifulworkpodcast.com. They take you to the same place, and the links are there to look at Patreon, sign up for the newsletter. And while you're there, yes, I am also a musician and a basketball coach, a college basketball coach. And so I've got all 5 records on the website, and you can find those links to iTunes and Spotify for the music to check out as well. All right, that's enough bugging you about all that stuff. Really excited to get a chance to sit down with Kenny and Ryan. They are a crack up to talk to, but they are really smart guys and have done a ton for the bourbon whiskey industry and are continuing to do so. So without further ado, let's get to the show. Kenny Coleman and Ryan Cecil are the co-creators, masterminds, and hosts of the wildly popular and number 1 ranked bourbon podcast, Bourbon Pursuit. The duo began the podcast in March of 2015, and since then have built it into a widely respected source of all things whiskey and bourbon. Their weekly show hosts guests from all across the whiskey industry, from master distillers, historians, CEOs, marketers, and much, much more. The pair, known for their mix of light humor with thoughtful interviews, continues to grow the podcast and are often invited to speak at festivals, review new bottles of whiskey, host single barrel picks, and much more. Kenny and Ryan are here today to discuss the early years of growing the show, sharing drinks with legends of the industry, and play the popular game of overrated or underrated. Okay, I am joined now. I have the pleasure of being joined by Kenny Coleman and Ryan Cecil. Kenny and Ryan are the creators and hosts of one of my favorite podcasts and the best podcast out there on bourbon called Bourbon Pursuit. And we are excited to dive in and talk about a bunch of stuff bourbon related. So guys, welcome to the show.
Hey, happy to be here.
Yeah, super excited to be on. Appreciate it.
Now, I know you guys are licking your wounds a little bit. It was a Kentucky Derby yesterday as we're recording this. And I hear you guys, or Ryan, you throw a pretty fun Kentucky Derby party. Is that true?
Well, define fun, but no. if 10 screaming kids running around in circles and that, like it's a horse track at my house, then that's fun. But no, we do have a good get together with friends and family, and Kenny is nice enough to provide some awesome mint juleps, and we tend to open up some pretty good bottles. So yeah, it's a good time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm still trying to catch up on sleep because I went to two parties. I was at Ryan's party and went to another party after that, and that party went to around almost midnight. And after starting to drink around 1 or 2 that day, it was much more of a marathon than I anticipated.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you guys being able to make it to this podcast.
Yeah, it's one of those things. If you haven't been to Louisville or the Derby, like we think it's like the whole town shuts down for a week, and you don't realize that people that have never been to it or have never experienced are like, it's just a horse race. But it's like literally this crazy 1 week, 2 week sprint of cocktail parties, events, horse tracks, golf scrambles, all this stuff. So it's a ton of fun and brings a lot of energy and excitement to Kentucky, but I'm kind of glad it's came to an end. My body can't handle it anymore.
Right.
Absolutely. Need a good 48 hours to recover there.
For sure.
Kenny, your mint juleps, I heard you talking about it on one of your recent podcasts. So what goes in to these special mint juleps that you make?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like it's a crazy recipe. I originally did it because, you want to go to a party and you want to have a mint julep, but most of the stuff that you can buy that's pre-mixed off the shelf, it's usually typically it's either like super minty or it's not boozy enough. And if you want to do it the proper way, then it takes a lot of work. You got to get the ice. You got to get, your little dropper with the simple syrup. And I just said, there's got to be a better way. And so I ended up, I ripped off a recipe that I had seen a long time ago. That's the best way to put it. And I rebranded it as my own and actually started putting it out there. But what I do is I kind of make this like big batch of better boozy mint juleps. And really what that is to kind of really boil it down is you get a 1.75 liter of your favorite, like Bottled in Bond or 100 proof, or maybe like Wild Turkey 101, Old Forester 100 proof. Those are like really good, solid bourbons that are everyday values. Plus, you've got, it's better than just 86 proof. And it's also a rye-based mash bill. I prefer a rye-based mash bill because if you try to do something with a wheated-based mash bill, it's going to get almost like too sweet at that point.
Okay.
And so you take 2 cups out of there, and then you do a simple syrup with the mint mixed into it, and you kind of like stew that over for about an hour for just on your stovetop. And then after that, you basically just drain it off into a something with a spout, and then you pour it back into the 1.75 liter. And then from there, you've got a pretty good mint julep batch that, at least for a few years at Ryan's party, it's the one that kind of got the party going for a while.
It's dangerously delicious, I'll tell you that. It's 2 of those, and you're like, well, party started. Here we go.
Right. Well, that sounds awesome. Well, let's kind of pivot and talk about Bourbon Pursuit. And I want you guys, though, to take me back. March 9th, 2015, you guys release your first episode. And how did it get to the point where over 4 years ago, you guys wanted to do a podcast on bourbon? You know, whose idea was it first? How did you guys get involved with it? What's sort of the backstory with you two?
Ryan, you want to take it, or you want me to run with it?
I'll start off, and you'll probably tell more details than I will. I'll kind of give the short version. But basically, I had been listening to podcasts. I own a couple other businesses that are home services, lawn care, kind of pest control businesses. I'm in my truck a lot, so I listen to a lot of podcasts. And it's one of those things. I was looking for stuff that I was interested in. I was actually wanting to start a lawn care podcast, and kind of did some research and kind of real fast figured out that wasn't going to work. There's not too much of an audience for that. So I started looking at other things I was interested in. And a buddy of mine who is in the bourbon industry was like, why don't you do a podcast on bourbon? You know everybody in the industry, because I say this a lot on the show. I'm from Bardstown. So it's a given. That's the bourbon capital of the world. I kind of grew up around it. So I have the luxury of knowing a bunch of people in the industry. So I kind of was like, well, let me see what we can do with it. So Kenny and I had become friends through our wives, actually. And I knew he was in the bourbon collecting, kind of trading and stuff. So, and I knew he had a background in tech and did a lot of public speaking. So I was like, I'm an idea person. I really like to think of ideas, kind of big picture, but I'm not the best at implementing it. So I was like, Kenny just seemed like the perfect partner to kind of help execute this podcast and get it rolling, because I had the idea, but I wasn't exactly sure how to do it. So I got with him, and the first time we sat in my basement and kind of sat around a laptop and terribly threw together a podcast with me and him just sitting around my couch and a microphone. You know, it's like with any business I've ever started, like people always ask me like, well, how did you do it, or how'd you get it? And I was like, I was too dumb to not do it. Like I didn't understand exactly what all it took, what it meant. I just kind of go in there with blind enthusiasm just because I'm an entrepreneur and excited about all my ideas, even if they're good or bad. And so that's kind of how it kind of got started. And I'll let Kenny build off that.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things that, you know, Ryan came to me with this idea, and the way that I come from in that sort of tech background, you have an idea, like anybody says like, oh, I got an idea for an app. And you're like, are you sure? Have you researched it? Because I'm pretty sure what you're thinking of has probably been done already. Mm-hmm. And so I said, well, let's research and sort of see what's out there. And at the time, there were a few whiskey and bourbon podcasts out there, but they focused on a different thing. They were very news centric, or it was a few guys sitting around a microphone and saying, oh, I'm drinking Elmer T. Lee. I get notes of caramel and oak, like a regular bourbon. I'm thinking to myself, like, who would actually want to listen to this? Like, what's an angle that's missing? And so I kind of took a page out of my manager at the time. He runs a very successful tech podcast, and his is like an interview format. And the idea was at the time is that, well, we're nobodies in this bourbon world. So why would anybody listen to us about what we're saying or what we're drinking? So instead, we figured, let's be the idiots that ask all the questions, and we'll invite guests on that are really the know-all and be-all in the bourbon world. So they become the authoritative source, and they're the ones that actually are really giving the audience the education, the information they want. And so that's kind of really how we started. We started looking around and honestly just like blindly emailing people and saying like, hey, do you want to come on this podcast about bourbon? And at the very beginning, you know, we even had Harlan Wheatley, the master distiller, Buffalo Trace, like one of the first ones that we did. And, you know, a lot of these people took a big gamble on us in the very beginning. And you got to understand, we had never done a podcast before. We didn't know what we were doing. We were flying by the seat of our pants. We didn't know if we had the right equipment. We didn't know if we were using the right software, the right music. And we just kind of went with it. So the show has definitely progressed over time, where the first probably 20, 30 episodes, looking back, in my opinion, they're pretty garbage. They're bad. They're horrible. Our interview skills are terrible. The audio is terrible. And it's like, if I could go back in time, knowing what we know now, we would redo things a little bit. But
that's part of the process. You gotta fail forward. If you try to figure it all out and do it all perfectly beforehand, then you'll never do it. So that's kind of part of the process that we've gone through with this thing. It's been, just a kind of an adventure of, let's try this. Oh, that didn't work. Well, let's try this, and then it's been a fun ride for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even with that, gosh, we've had so many mistakes along the way. I think we interviewed Sean Higgins at Mid Julep Tours one time, and we go in there and we have a great conversation. We're sitting there, we got the microphone up, we got the computer going, we're sitting there talking, and then we leave and we realize, Jesus, we forgot to press the record button. And so it's like those are the early days when you just realize like, oh, we're so green at this. But since then we've gotten, as I mentioned, a whole heck of a ton better, a little bit more professional. The audio's gotten a lot better. And that's because of, one, we finally figured out what we were doing, but two, knowing that people actually listen to the show and they're investing in us is really what kind of drove that motivation even further.
And so for those that are listening to you guys on this podcast, you guys right now, you have which I love, you have a fact sheet, like a data sheet on your website where I would assume, people that are interested in working with you guys, partnering up with the podcast can see the numbers per episode. And, right now, the latest one you have up over 1.5 million downloads, over 10,000 downloads per podcast. I mean, and I'm sure those are constantly growing. When did you guys see like a sort of tipping point or change in it going from, hey, you two guys getting people on and it was a building podcast to where all of a sudden, oh, wow, this is something much bigger now?
I don't know if I remember the exact point when I saw like a huge spike in the audience. It's always been a steady growth and climb for a while. There was I'd say probably about 6 or 7 months ago it plateaued, and then we kind of reshifted and did a few things, and now we see the growth starting to happen again. But it was just something that it just started off as probably just in the tens to hundreds of downloads in the first part, and we were kind of lucky in being able to do that. We kind of thought strategically, what are those guests that we need to bring on to actually start getting our name out there. And so like in the first 10 podcasts that released, one of them was with the biggest whiskey or bourbon blogger that's out there. And so him putting it in his newsletter automatically, helped create that sort of network. And this is Blake from Bourboner.com. He kind of got us into his network. And when he's blasting this out to 40 or 50,000 subscribers on his email list, it was a pretty easy way to kind of like get the ball rolling pretty quickly.
Yeah. And then with that, with any startup or any kind of venture, like you have this initial enthusiasm that kind of carries you through, the first probably like year to 18 months, but then you kind of go what they call through the dip, where you've done all this work, but you're not really seeing results. And so I remember Kenny and I were on our way back from Wild Turkey, and he's like, man, this is just like so much work. And we're not really seeing anything. And I'm like, I know, but because Kenny at the time was investing a lot more time than I was. He kind of helped catapult us through because I had so much other time invested in my other businesses. But I was like, look, man, I've been through this before in other ventures. Like when you think it's not going to work, you just got to get through that dip and it's going to start catapulting. And then sure enough, like, I don't know, it was probably what, Kenny, about after 24 months, 28 months, like we really started to kind of see a following and people starting asking, when's more content coming? We want more. And then Kenny kind of had the great idea from his wife to do a Patreon community because it was kind of something that we had this great community, but we weren't really interacting and not rewarding them for supporting us. So that's really kind of helped build this great community and kind of help catapult our numbers as well. And so it kind of took about, 2 years to really start seeing the fruit harvested from, I guess, the seeds we were planting all that time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was really a turning point because there was a time when it was kind of like, I think we've had enough here. We'll give it just a little bit longer, and we'll see if anything comes of it. Because as Ryan had said, we had to figure out a way to try and turn some. You're investing a lot of time in this. I was probably between my actual day job and the podcast, I was running 70, 80 hours a week. With doing both of these. Yeah, I mean, it was just a lot of time that was invested. I mean, as you can imagine, the time that you spent scheduling guests and the talking, this is actually the easy part. Yeah. All the hard stuff is on the back end. That's
Absolutely.
the hard part. And so that's when the Patreon sort of thing sort of came up, and really that's kind of really what lit a fire again, because we, as anybody that's out there that does a podcast, selling ad spots and advertising is hard. It sucks. It's a lot of time that's invested. You're spending a lot of time chasing after a few bucks here and there, and it's hard to find those long-term partners. And the few lucky ones out there can actually make that happen. And Patreon just sort of gave us an avenue, an opportunity to really help let our community drive it. Ryan likes to say that the bourbon business is stuck in like the 1950s. Like, they don't want to change their ways. So you don't see a whole lot of bourbon companies throwing money at podcast advertising. And so being able to have a community rally around it is really what helps this really continue to drive to this day.
It's a really interesting point you just brought up too, Kenny. And we were gonna talk about this later, but maybe this is a good time to dive in just about, there's kind of an older bourbon community, as you guys know very well, and then there's this sort of new wave of the younger generation where it's really catching on again. And what percentage of balancing, do you guys try to hit on both of those demographics for your listener base? And then also, like, when you talk about advertising and people like that, like our newer, say, younger bourbon companies now coming forward and realizing that a podcast is a good idea, or is it still difficult to crack through that?
When I think of the actual, like, our target of who we're hitting on, whether it's the younger consumer or it's the person that's been in the game for a while, I don't really think that we choose one or the other, because our goal in this podcast is basically just continued education. Like, how can we continually put out a new episode where it doesn't matter if you're new to the bourbon game or you're just getting into this world, or if you are a seasoned veteran, you're going to learn something new by listening to the guests that day. And that's really what our goal is going to be at the end of it. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's sometimes when we throw out 3-letter acronyms like OWA, GTS, whatever it is, that people are like, oh, okay, I'm totally lost now. Like, you don't understand what I'm talking about. And so the seasoned people, they understand that, but the new people, they're like, okay, I need to go figure out what this means and go Google it or something like that.
But with that, even, when it is fun for us to do like the rookie or newbie kind of podcast as well. And I think even for, some of our listeners that are more advanced in their bourbon knowledge or whatever, it's fun to kind of revisit those things that got you excited into the hobby at first. So like, it's nice to cover both ends of the spectrum, because sometimes you forget what it was like being such a newbie and the excitement that, got you through there. So definitely like doing all types of coverage, because it's all exciting to us. We're bourbon geeks, and our audience is as well.
Sure. Do you guys have any personal highlights from the past 4 years and 200 episodes later that were personally like, wow, I can't believe I'm talking to this person, or I can't believe this has happened? Anything in those 4 years?
For me, when I look at it, I'm still, I think it's more outside of the bourbon community, because I'll have friends, they'll call us like bourbon royalty, like, oh, are you sitting with the Van Winkles now and Bob Baffert's box at the Derby or something? And we're like, no, like we're not there yet or anything like that. But it is really cool to be able to meet a lot of these people in the bourbon industry. And I think it's probably just like anything else. You meet these people and they're just down to home, actual good people. These aren't people that were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. These are people that were working hard when nobody wanted to buy bourbon. And now all of a sudden they're looked at as rock stars. So most of them are pretty humble in how they interact and how they really portrayed themselves, especially being in front of a camera, or even meeting people out. Because I'm sure, 10, 15 years ago, I don't think many of them thought they would be signing bottles of whiskey at liquor stores around the country. That just wasn't really what they were doing. Back then, they were still trying to get people just to try and buy it. Like, try it. I swear it's good. So there's, if I had to choose a name that really kind of stands out of one that's been always humbling and always a good person to know is Freddie Johnson of Buffalo Trace. He's just got such a great story, a great past, and he's got a great passion for the whiskey as well as his family history at the distillery itself. So he's just one person that is always fun and interesting to talk to, because it seems like he never ends with the stories.
Yeah, and to just piggyback off what Kenny was talking about, yeah, I mean, you got to understand, bourbon's only been cool for maybe 8 to 10 years. And growing up around, nobody cared about it. Nobody knew who Freddie Noe was or Booker Noe, or they did because it's on a bottle, but they didn't care. And so this is all new and exciting to them as well. And so, and you got to understand, we're in Kentucky, so it's a Southern, type. Not Southern type. It is the South, and we're just down to earth, humble people for the most part. And
well, some people don't think we're part of the South, so you gotta like that one too.
That's true, but I consider us the South, but we're the most northern South state. But we're just real hospitable people. We love to have a good time and tell stories. Whether they're true or not, that's to be determined. But no, I definitely don't feel like any special or bourbon royalty. Like, people think like we're experts, or then I'm like, no. Trust me, I am no expert. I just do this because this is selfishly for me and Kenny to learn more and to meet new people. And that's what it's all about. And probably just a couple guests. I mean, one time I did think I was in bourbon royalty when we interviewed Bill Thomas, and then he invited me to his house in Washington, D.C. Bill Thomas owns Jack Rose, one of the biggest whiskey bars in the world in Washington, D.C. And then he invited me to stay at his house, and I was there, and he's opening up Van Winkle Rye in green glass, crazy bottles. And I'm like, all right, this is kind of crazy. But no, one person I was really, truly honored and just loved meeting was Buddy Thompson, who he started a Final Reserve project. It was a 27-year-old. There's 4 or 5 different.
No. It was 47 years old.
47 years old. Yeah, sorry. 47 years old. And he was the old president of Glenmore Distillery back in Owensboro. And you just see that he was in the bourbon boom, then the downfall, then the boom, and then just all the people and stories he had. It was truly an honor. And he sadly passed away a few weeks ago. But Kenny had texted me and said he had passed, and I was like, that was one person I was truly honored to sit with and just hear his stories and everything he's been through.
This episode's featured bar and bartender is Chris Daly from Boss Cat Kitchen and Libations in Newport Beach, California. Boss Cat was once again named one of the top bourbon bars in America. Chris is here to talk about the signature drinks at Boss Cat, as well as some advice on making your own.
The signature drink of the restaurant's called the Boss Cat. So that one was Basil Hayden whiskey, a little lemon cordial, basil, rosemary, bitters on top. It's kind of a play on a whiskey sour, but it was designed to be a light, easy drinker before the whiskey movement kind of hit really hard, to where everybody kind of started drinking old fashions all the time. So that was kind of your introductory. Everybody can drink it and enjoy it if they haven't really drank whiskey before, or if they just want something that's casual, that's easy to drink with dinner.
What's something the more seasoned whiskey drinkers might order that you guys make?
I would say the Kentucky Orange Blossom. That one's Buffalo Trace with elderflower liqueur, sweet vermouth, a little bit of orange zest, orange bitters. That was kind of like if a Manhattan and an old fashioned had a baby. That'd be kind of their love child.
Okay.
That's the only way to describe that one. Yeah.
Okay. And hey, how about any pieces of advice for someone that wanted to mix drinks at their own house?
Just do what you want to do that is being creative and fun. You don't have to go by any strict guidelines or recipe rules that some other guy made up. I mean, if you have the basic knowledge and you want to try something, make it and have other people try it.
The other thing that I think makes your guys' podcast so successful, I know you're interviewing a lot of great people, but you two yourselves have a lot to do with it as far as your kind of team dynamic, how you guys host a podcast. You know, Kenny, sort of, I don't know what you would say your role is officially, but you guys definitely have your defined roles, and I think it makes for a great listening experience. How long did it take you guys to sort of figure out what your dynamic was going to be as a duo?
I don't know, Ryan. What do you think? It's about 100 episodes.
Yeah, it's still going. No,
yeah,
no, it's definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. Yeah,
you know, Kenny's. I definitely from the onset, I knew Kenny's done this. You know, a lot of public speakings in the tech world, and I kind of leaned on him because I'm from. I say this again. I'm from Bardstown. I have an accent. I don't always think clearly at times. I just try to be and I don't always say what I'm thinking. And, you know, when you're on a microphone and live with people, things can, and you're like, kind of fumble through sometimes. But Kenny's very good at directing the conversation. And if we get off track, he can kind of do the outline and get us back on track and get the flow going, and which I enjoy. And then I just kind of like to banter or just throw in like my naivete of the subject or like what I don't know. I'm just a common man, and like there's no dumb questions. And so that's kind of how I approach it. And I think we're just as real as possible. We're not out there to like prove to anyone or do anything, like to say that we're smarter or anything. We're just kind of, it's fun for us. And I think we're just real. And I think people relate to that. They like people who are real, and I think that's
absolutely
what makes us so successful.
Yeah, we're definitely not acclaimed critics or bourbon royalty or just bourbon anything knowledge. You know, people look at us like we're full of bourbon knowledge, but really we kind of, this was all a learning journey for both of us. And yeah, as Ryan said, that's sort of what I like to do. Is I try to help control the flow, the way things are going. And Ryan always has a pretty funny thing he says, because we typically will record stuff that are done remotely over things like Google Hangouts. So we have a little bit more of a video interaction and people can join in with us. And he can always say, look, I can tell Kenny's head's about to explode. We need to change the conversation.
Like I can just tell, like, when we're in a room with a guest, and, you know, especially that we've now added a third team member, Fred, which has been great. But sometimes like Fred or I will get off on a tangent and like with the other guest, and I can just look over and see Kenny just like moving around, twitching, like messing with knobs. And I'm like, all right, he's ready. He's ready to move on. So let's go.
That's great. Well, speaking of Fred Minnick, how did you guys get involved with him, and how did he become to be part of the podcast?
I think this goes back again to one of those points where we kind of said, all right, are we doing something right with the podcast? And as Ryan always says, he always says that as soon as you think that it's all over, like something swoops back in and you come up on another high note. And it was probably about this time last year, maybe a little bit before this time last year. You know, we've had Fred on the podcast a few times beforehand, and we love having him on because he's a beacon of knowledge, and people talk about him and think, oh, he's wearing an ascot. He's so stuck up. Like, why would you listen? But if you get to know him, he is so down to earth and a truly good person. Pretty funny too. But anyway, we had these conversations with him, and we always told him, we said, hey, you know, right now we're on a good trajectory. The only person that could ever take this down and we would be in an uphill battle against somebody would be you if you started your own podcast. And oddly enough, his PR people said, Fred, you need to go start a podcast. And I don't think he understood probably all of the work that goes into the back end of
Fred works on a typewriter, so there's no way he's going to be able to execute like getting a microphone and recorders and software. And so, yeah, he can't even handle Google Docs. So,
yeah.
But, it was pretty fortunate that Fred had actually reached out to us, and he said, I want to get into doing this, and this is what I can offer. Here's the audience I can help bring. I can get you some more high profile guests. And we, Ryan and I looked at each other. We said, this is probably a really good opportunity to pivot the show and grow again. And I think that's, as I'd mentioned earlier, we're on an ongoing journey to just try and develop better content, to try to figure out how do we kind of keep raising the bar more and more, because we're not the only bourbon podcast out there now. There's plenty of other ones that can go and you can fill your time up with and listening to them, when we don't release our show, or if we release it once a week, but, during the other hours of the week that you're wanting to listen. But, that was just something that we said, we got to continually grow and figure out how do we keep people engaged, and how do we really keep setting the bar higher that we can continue to just sort of just stay in that number one spot.
Yeah. And with Fred, like Kenny said, I always say the bourbon industry is stuck in, like, especially in marketing, advertising. They're so traditional. It's like, let's get a print ad, or get a billboard, or a bus stop. Right. And so Fred had been successful in covering bourbon in a traditional media way, and already had his foot in the door with a lot of people that weren't giving us a chance, because we're like, podcast, what the hell? No, I ain't talking to you all. And so, Fred was able to get us some really influential guests in the bourbon industry that they wouldn't even answer our calls, or said, nope, we're not interested. And so that's really kind of helped catapult us to get, just more relevance to the people that are big influencers in the bourbon game, but are kind of stuck, in the old traditional media mindset.
Yeah, I mean, one of those was, for the longest time, I remember when Ryan and I first started, we said we should get a cooperage on. Like, how cool would it be to figure out like how the barrels are built? What's the science behind it? And we sent emails to Independent Stave for 2 years asking for them to get on the podcast. Fred sends one email, and within 30 seconds, we have the CEO of the goddamn company on. It's like that's the door that gets open. So it's just, he's got those connections, and really being able to get high profile people like that. For anybody, that Independent Stave is their barrel manufacturer out of Lebanon, Kentucky. And so that's just one of those people. And by the way, they're like the biggest that there is. So they supply a lot of people in the bourbon industry, at least a lot of the big players out there. Yep. And so getting a lot of those high profile guests is again, what helps kind of cement the spot and keeps continuing to grow.
Yeah. And Fred and his whole team really has a pulse of what is going on in the bourbon game now, but what's going into the future. And so it's just been really a pleasure. He's really helped. We've been riding his coattails, like with Bourbon Beyond's a huge music festival here. And he asked us to MC some talks, with some high profile master distillers and guests that never really came on the show before. And so he's really just been great partner for us to kind of help grow our brand and keep riding this wave of bourbon as it continues to grow.
And he now has Bourbon Plus magazine, right? That's coming out, or, is in the process of, have they released their first edition?
Yeah, they got, I think two issues out right now. So it comes out once a quarter. Right. So bourbonplus.com, you can go check it more out there.
Yeah. And we had, Carla Carlton, who's one of the executive editors at Bourbon Plus, on the podcast. And I know that their team that they have over there is doing a lot. And I'm sure for you guys that helps as well, having just another person in kind of that part of the community, for sure.
Well, because you got to understand, like Fred is all in bourbon 24 hours a day. So he's got his finger on the pulse pretty much all the time, because that's his full-time job. Ryan and I, we have other full-time jobs outside of doing the bourbon and the podcasting thing. So having him always knowing what's going on, having the kind of contacts. Basically, anybody that's in the bourbon business, he's got them in a cell phone. So it's just one of those things where, as Ryan had said, it's a very healthy partnership of what we've been able to help contribute to each other in this.
Whiskey is undoubtedly in the middle of a boom. A little over a decade ago, the American whiskey industry was flat on its back, struggling through decades of weak sales, underinvestment, and the serious lack of a cool factor. But now, whiskey is everywhere. Hip bourbon bars are popping up all over America. Craft distilleries, cocktail competitions, music festivals, and more continue to grow in popularity. And what has caused this shift? Was it the popularity of the hit TV show Mad Men, where Don Draper drank old-fashioned in sea-level suites in expensive suits? The growth of Instagram and the photogenic design of a new bottle of bourbon? America's parallel interest in the farm-to-table movement? Celebrity chefs using it at their new restaurants? Whatever the reason, it has grown exponentially fast. Some reports have American whiskey sales soaring by over 40% in the past 5 years alone, turning it into a multi-billion dollar industry. With this spike in popularity, and with more and more businesses and distilleries entering the marketplace to try and capitalize on the boom, where will the industry continue to go and grow? Kenny and Ryan bring up an underlying theme in the industry of some of the older companies or distilleries being slower to change and innovate, at times stuck in old ways of advertising and distributing. But will the newer, hipper companies be able to gain enough of a footing in a crowded market to last for the long haul when the boom takes an inevitable dip? Podcasts like Kenny and Ryan's Bourbon Pursuit have been an important part of the growth of bourbon and whiskey the past decade. This newer form of media allowing people to discover, discuss, and dive deeper into the drink they've come to love. The whiskey industry has been through its ups and downs before, but fans of the drink are hoping this current boom creates staying power that will allow companies, new and old, to continue to deliver their favorite nightcap. Guys, I want to play a fun game I've heard other podcasts do called Overrated or Underrated.
Okay.
And I can edit anything out if you don't like what you said after the fact. But I want to give you guys a couple of bourbon things that are going on in the bourbon industry, and you can tell me if you think it's overrated or underrated, or if it's, I guess, properly rated. So the first one I'll give you is like second barrel finishing. So for those listening, that's, where the bourbon's taken out of one barrel where it's aged and it's put into a second barrel to age again for some amount of time. So second barrel finishing, or maybe it is a better term that you guys can tell me to use, but is that the drink itself, in your opinion, overrated or potentially underrated as how it tastes as a bourbon?
I'll go overrated. There's very few that I've had that I've been like, wow, this was a good idea. I'm glad they put the effort into the second barrel. But no, I mean, but I'm a traditionalist. I mean, growing up around bourbon and stuff, I mean, if you have to finish in something, you're hiding it. And so I don't know. I think it's overrated.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm kind of agreement with Ryan on that one. I think it's overrated too. You know, there's a lot of people out there in the industry. They look at it as, oh, this is our angle where we can make a difference. We can finish a bourbon in X, Y, and Z casks, and we can charge X amount of money for it. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of trickery, I think, that goes in behind the scenes too, because to be qualified as a straight bourbon whiskey, it can't do that, but you have to say this straight bourbon whiskey was finished in X, Y, or Z barrels. And there's actually, I think it was like only 2.5% of the actual liquid can be of that finishing product.
Okay.
But there's no math and there's no science involved of what says, well, how much port was actually left in that port barrel before you filled it up with whiskey? Like, there's nothing out there. So a lot of the stuff that's on the market today could actually be technically breaking those legal implications or qualifications or whatever it is. So there's definitely a lot of things out there that are kind of like, I don't know. And Ryan kind of said it first, like there's a purist that comes out in this and you're kind of thinking like, okay, I just want a good bourbon whiskey. Now there's been plenty of companies out there, the Angel's Envy and the Joseph Magnuses that do a pretty good job at doing barrel finished bourbons. But for the most part, for us and our palate, it's not there for me. You know, it's something that I'm still a traditionalist at the end of the day when it comes to it.
Okay.
And don't get me wrong, there's some great products. Kenny mentioned 2 of them, and it's nice to have that as a change up every now and then. But it's just gone too far. There's just too many people kind of hanging their hat on that, and it's like, all right, guys. I mean, somebody else has already been doing this for a while. You're doing nothing new, and it's. But anyway,
okay.
That's like the whole like Jim Beam legend thing that came out.
Yeah.
You know, there's just very recently. You know, Jim Beam came out with what they called a quote unquote brand new bourbon. It's technically not a bourbon. And that's what we have. We have a few different guests on the show. One of them is Wade, and he knows the TTB handbook back and forward, and so he's on a mission to make sure that Jim Beam kind of crushes under this weight of calling it a bourbon, because it's actually not classified as a bourbon. It's a whiskey specialty is what it's actually legally classified under.
Interesting.
And so and so when you get into this, when you go this deep, I guess you can say, and I guess that's the problem, is that some of your listeners might be thinking like, who cares?
What are we talking about?
But this is the thing, like people like us, we actually care. We give a lot of craps about this. And so it's when it starts playing with these iffy kind of gray areas, and then marketing just runs with it and starts calling it the next new bourbon that's out there. And the people like us are like, but it's not even actually a bourbon. So how can you call it that? So it's one of those things that I think it's going to be a continual battle we'll be fighting for a while.
Okay. So right now
but don't get me wrong. There's still a place for it. There are still good finishes out there.
I do love this game. Let's keep going.
Okay. So I got more.
Awesome.
So overrated or underrated? So 95% I know of bourbon is made in Kentucky, but the 5% that's made outside of Kentucky, the bourbon that's made in Colorado or Utah or parts of California, from what you've been able to taste, overrated or underrated non-Kentucky bourbon?
Oh, that's a tough one, because I'm going to have to say under a little bit. Now, this is kind of where we stand is if we look at the state of the union of bourbon right now, is that there are hundreds of distilleries that are across America right now. And the one thing that they have not had, the whole like climate thing, like Kentucky is great weather for the barrels. They go in and out during the hot and cold. It's all right. It's kind of a BS story though. And it's just an easy
Tennessee
one to give.
And Virginia,
Tennessee, Ohio,
weather,
Virginia, New York. Yeah, they all have the same weather. And so the one thing that Kentucky has had on its side is time, right? They've had time and they've had stocks. And so when you have
experience, you have hundreds of years of experience.
Absolutely. So you got those three things. And so when you're able to release a 6-year-old bourbon that is at 100 proof, and you can do it in a $20 bottle, that is a very, very tough game to get into when you're a distiller outside of Kentucky and you've just been around for 2 years and you're trying to sell a 2-year product or a 3-year product in a bottle at $90. Like that's a tough decision that most people, like the average consumer, just they're going to see age and they're going to see price and they're going to say, like, why would I even go towards this route? And so there's definitely there will be a time here I'm gonna guess in the next 5 years where we're going to be back into a situation where there's going to be a good amount of high aged and quality stock that are coming from outside of Kentucky. And that's because right now, most of the things that are outside of Kentucky, you're hitting into the 3, 4, and even 5 and 6 year age on some of these things. And so when you're looking at hitting some double digit numbers with something that's outside of the state, you're going to start finding that you're going to be able to get a lot more unique taste profiles. And you don't necessarily have to just rely on always having Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. So I see this as an underrated category that's going to continue to grow and thrive.
Ryan, what about you?
I think it's so on a whole, most of it's overrated.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, to be fair, Ryan's right. I mean, we get a bottle in the mail probably once a week from craft distiller, and they all I would say 95% of what we get is just dog shit. It's terrible. And so it's kind of like, oh, here we go, another one.
Yeah, but I'll caveat with it. There is some very good young distillers out there who have some underrated juice, and which makes me excited for the future of bourbon. But yeah, like most of these guys don't know what the hell they're doing. They're just trying to start something up. They're excited. They're trying to take advantage of a boom, and it reflects in their juice. And so, but there are a few out there that are just nailing it, and you can tell at very young ages, their products are like standing out at even a young age. And so I'm excited for these rare few that are going to make a name in the bourbon game outside of Kentucky, but overrated on a whole.
If you don't mind me asking, who would that be? Those few that come to mind that are doing it well?
First of all is Finger Lakes Distilling out of New York. They have a product line called McKinsey Rise and Wheated Bourbons. We're actually partnering with them we started our own Bourbon Brand Pursuit series, where we're releasing different distilleries, single barrels that we are allowed to pick from, and we're picking the best single barrels. But we have vetted many distilleries, and Finger Lakes at their 3-year rise and their 5-year wheated bourbons are like, you can put them up against anything here in Kentucky. And they stand out. And I'm not just saying that because we're selling it. It's just good stuff. And then there's a company out of Baltimore. I'm not sure what the parent company name is. Kenny, you'll have to help me. But they have a brand called Epic Rye. That's a 2 or 3 year rye product. And man, we were pretty blown away with that. And what's the one out of Washington, Kenny, that
is it Wyoming whiskey? Is that what we're thinking of? Or
no, not Wyoming. That's in Wyoming, not Washington.
You're probably right. I think it starts with a W as well.
Or Woodinville.
Woodinville.
It's so good I can't remember it. But anyways, no, they have some great stuff. So it's the future is exciting. And then you got some big players like High West out there. They got some great people backing their products for the future. So, I mean, there's just going to be some good stuff out there to come.
Well, the bottles that you guys get sent weekly that you don't like, I'd be happy to give you my address to forward it down my way. And
no, you don't. I promise. I wouldn't send some of them to my worst enemy.
Okay. Okay, last one of the overrated, underrated. Pappy Van Winkle is kind of like the top of the mountain as far as bourbon drinkers wanting a taste of that. I know both of you guys have had Pappy Van Winkle before. That first taste of it, over, under, or properly rated?
For me, I think it's probably properly rated. I think it does get a little bit too much of a unicorn status nowadays for the general populace, which people are like, oh, I got to try it. Y'all, believe me, you don't need to try it. It's okay. After you try it, all of a sudden you don't have like a vision of God. Like your life is not changed. And as Ryan likes to say, it's just another bottle of bourbon. And it really is at the end of the day, because it's doing it wrong. It's really good whiskey. It's really good. But it's not worth the crazy amount that people are paying for it. So if we want to just say the whiskey's good. It's a really good whiskey. If you're thinking, is it good for $1,000 for a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle 15? No, hell no, it's not. That's a very overrated thing to put it on that side of that kind of a pedestal, because there's plenty of great bottles out there for $50 and even less that you can get that are, a wheated mash bill that are all still coming from the same distillery. So you just got to be able to be on the lookout and sort of have the knowledge as well to make sure that you don't fall in that trap.
Yeah,
sure.
And Pappy's one of those things. It's like being a whiskey geek, you want to hate it because you're like, why are people? It's so stupid. And then you drink it, and it's like, it is really good juice. And I mean, like Kenny and I, we were doing some reviews, messing around the other day, and we had a Pappy 15, and I was like, damn, you forget it is really good whiskey. The problem is at secondary market values, it's not worth it. I mean, it's great, but not like $1,000 good. So I'd say it's probably it's good at retail value. Above that, then it's a hard pass for me.
Okay. Well, guys, thanks for playing the overrated, underrated.
Dan, what about you? Have you tried Van Winkle before?
So that's not. I've not been able to try it yet. So when I do, though, I'll have to let you guys know.
Oh, we can probably make that happen. I can probably get you a sample set in the mail for you and make a dream come true.
You would. So yeah, I'll have to let you guys know, because one of my favorite scenes though from a movie, what is it, The Internship, where you guys seen that with Vince Vaughn?
Oh yes, yeah.
And Owen Wilson, and they buy the Pappy Van Winkle to celebrate, and then they figure out their company's closed, and it's a good scene there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I know exactly what you're talking about. And then even at the end of the movie, they bring it back out.
That's right.
They're outside, outside the Google headquarters holding the bottle of it.
You can actually trace like the Pappy hysteria to that movie, like to the timeline that came out, and then the hysteria kind of went through the roof after, and then you start seeing it more and more in celebrities and public eye. It kind of just started taking off from there.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has catapulted it. The crazy thing is about all that is that the Van Winkles themselves, they're good people, but they don't see a dime of the crazy prices that you see, because you understand, like when it goes from the wholesaler to the distributor, like that's all the money they make. They don't make it when actually, because they sell it at probably what, Ryan, maybe $50 a bottle. Like that's their margin on it. And then when a retailer sells it for $1,000, they make all the margin on it. So it's I feel bad for the Van Winkles who don't actually get to get a big chunk of this fandom and this fame that has kind of followed along with it.
Well, they're doing just fine, but yes, it is. It is. That's a whole nother discussion about the 3-tier system. But yes, it is a shame that they don't get to see all the fruit of that brand. But it is crazy that the bottles, $1,000 for a 15-year is that's just an expensive piss, man. I'd say that all the time. It's
crazy. That's good. I like that. Hey, last couple of questions I like to ask all of the guests that come on the podcast, and it's a little bit more just kind of career oriented. So the first one, and either one of you guys can go first, is what's one of the best investments that you've made in your career?
I'll go first. Probably for me, it's just probably downloading and listening to podcasts and investing in books. I read probably, I'd say 3 to 4 books a month, and not finishing them. I start them and kind of jump back and forth. I'm ADD, so I'm kind of all over the place, but really just, I like to learn and listen to other people that have kind of, and with podcasts and books, you have this great resource where people have been where you've been through. And so you can kind of hear their story and hear the things that they went through, the doubts and all the challenges and the execution of it. So it's like, I'm just surprised that people don't read or listen to stuff. I'm like, it's all here. You just got to go put in the work to listen to it. So that's kind of been my biggest investment in my career.
Ryan, are you a nonfiction or fiction reader?
Nonfiction. I hate fiction. Like Game of Thrones, my wife loves it, and like I try to do 3 episodes, and I like fell asleep, and I'm just like, most of the books I read are either business or like mostly business or like kind of spiritual or self-improvement type stuff. So cool. I'm always trying to learn in those 3 pillars.
Awesome.
Yeah, Ryan sends me quotes all the time, and he's like, "It's gonna get better, I promise." I'm like, okay, all right. There's the positive reinforcement I needed for today.
Yeah,
that's for awesome.
Sure. Kenny has to have everything make sense on a spreadsheet, whereas I'm kind of more of a big picture kind of person, so it works out well.
Okay,
that's actually very true. It's very true. I am the Google Sheets wizard on this team. That's for sure.
That's useful. Yep. Okay, what about you?
I would say the investment that I spend the most in is the time when I go all in on something. For my career outside of the podcast, I made a few lucky bets and right choices in the type of technology that I chose to really follow with a passion. And that's led into kind of finding what's the next thing. And when you find that next thing, that kind of catapults you to that next step on the ladder, and you kind of start navigating and finding your way through. When it comes to anything else, I really do. I go all in. Just to give you kind of a side note about like my past issues, like before the podcast, when I wasn't spending my time reading about bourbon, I used to live on a street where we were the largest Halloween like decor in the state. We were in national like publications. And so I used to spend 6 months out of my year building Halloween decorations. And so that's, I mean, like I said, I used to go all in. I'd learn how to like corpse bodies and how to use pneumatics to make something like a skeleton jump out of a coffin. and then we ended up leaving the house that was on the Halloween street. And so I had this huge void, and so bourbon started taking over at that point. And when you start just going down in something, you start just going further and further and further. And that's typically what I did is I would just invest time into doing that. And then after starting the podcast, investing time into learning about, it kind of goes back to Ryan and reading, starting to figure out exactly how do other people do it. This is the first time using, how we're recording this podcast through a different technology. And I was intrigued. So I started reading about it even before we started coming on here to see if we could even benefit from doing something like this. So when I go in all something, I start reading as much as I can to probably be the most educated about it. So
that's awesome. And you guys, talked earlier about you guys are not trying to come across as aficionados, or that, when you host a guest, but you could definitely tell you guys have prepared and that you've done your homework and that you've done your research so that you can, sit in a room with Chris Morris and talk about Woodford and, have a good conversation. So that definitely comes across in your guys' podcast. So, which is appreciated because it makes it a much better listen.
Well, Ryan, do you want to break the news to him? Because I don't know if the last time we've actually done that. Now we go in blind a lot. I remember in the old days, we would sit there and we would write lists of questions, and now we're kind of like, we'll wing it. We're pretty good now.
Well, and a lot of these people we interview, they're trained to do this. Like they've been through the PR and to be honest, they love talking about themselves. So you just throw a few softballs out there and they just start rambling. You're like, all right, well, here we go.
Oh, good. Hey, last question before we wrap up is, you guys are involved in your own lives. You have full-time jobs and doing other things. And you also have this podcast that's really taken off and is a large part of your life. What about the podcast and what about being a part of the overall bourbon community, which you guys are? What brings you the most joy in doing that?
For me, I would say, Ryan, I'll go take this one first. I mean, what brings me the most joy in it is when we see the public comments. Sorry, what? Are you all right over there, Ryan?
I dropped my phone. Sorry. I know it's house rules. Against the house rules. I broke my own rules. Sorry, Kenny.
Oh, we're still trying to teach him how to use that mute button.
That's all right.
No, I'm just kidding. No, like when we see the reviews that come in on iTunes, when you see people that comment on the videos on Facebook or YouTube, and you see people that are genuinely, even some of the emails, and they say, "Hey, I just got into bourbon. This is fantastic." I'll tell you this is a really good story. There was a lady who said she was actually moving across the country, and her dad were in the car together to kind of do this whole move. And so her and her dad listened to our podcast for the entire move across the country. And they said that, afterwards they felt a little bit more bonded about it because they were both getting into bourbon. They would go out, they'd buy bottles together, they'd go tastings together.
Wow.
Now they would, like, on Thursdays, they listen to their podcasts, on respective sides of the country. And after they listen to it, they call each other to talk about it. And so, like, it's one of those things that I'm kind of like, wow, like we're not only just like doing things that are cool and fun for us, but like we're impacting other people's lives and doing it in a very positive way too. Because, we're not bringing people down with news or politics or anything like that. Like we're doing something fun. This is like a break to get away from everyday normal life. And so this is something that we're at least that I'm happy to be able to bring something like this in a very positive attitude to a broader community out there.
That's a great story. Wow.
Well said. Yeah, and just to tail off that, I mean, just for me, like growing up around it and seeing like what it's become and just the impact it's had on my community and economically, but also socially. I mean, it's just bourbon's a social thing, and there's connection with people in the industry and the consumers. And it's when you get around people that have been around bourbon or into bourbon, like you have that common ground, and like you don't know what or that person's background may be or what he's going through or whatever, but you sit around and you open that bottle and you're trying different things, and there's just that moment where all everyday problems are gone, and you're just like, I call it bourbon mindfulness. You're kind of like in the zone and just enjoying the moment with people, and just seeing that with other people has been really rewarding. And then just like being able to meet some of our listeners, and like we do a thing with our Patreon community where they can come we do single barrel picks, and they show up, they drive and fly all over from the country to come pick a barrel of bourbon with me and Kenny. And I'm like, that is mind blowing to me. I'm Ryan Cecil and he's Kenny Coleman. I'm a nobody, and they're flying all the way to pick a barrel of bourbon with us. And like, just to see, which by the way, picking a barrel bourbon is probably one of the best and coolest things to do in ever. And so
if you're a whiskey geek, you remember, if you're a whiskey geek,
if you're a whiskey geek, yes. And so you see these people come from all over, and then they talk about how much they love the show. And then you just realize all that hard work and effort and energy you put into it, that somebody else enjoys it. It's just really humbling and gratifying, and it's an honor, really.
Wow, that was a lot of fun with Kenny and Ryan. Please make sure to go check out Bourbon Pursuit on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to podcasts. They have just a great show, a great setup, and you will not be disappointed. Please go to iTunes to like, rate, comment on this podcast, Beautiful Work Podcast, and go to the website, beautifulworkpodcast.com or dankrikorian.com to check out music, the rest of the podcast with show notes, as well as sign up for our newsletter. Well, we've got a couple more shows with our Whiskey Week series, so we hope to see you guys back very soon. And so wherever you are, whatever you're doing, keep making that beautiful work. See you soon.